So, the first of our elements that we're going to look here in session 2 is space. So we have that movement composition, the arrangement of parts to produce a complete and unified whole. So examples of this. So in freestyle, 50 meters, you have 5, the dive into the water, underwater section, the stroke, and then the finish on the wall. Or long jump, you have the run up, the takeoff, the flight, and then the landing in the pit. So performance is the act of putting all of these into practice. All right, and as it says here, elements of movement exist in all movement composition and affect your performance. So every action that you take, passive or active, involves the elements of movement. And as we're going to discuss, they are space, dynamics, time, and relationships. And having an understanding of these are vital as potential movement experts. Part of your job will be to analyze and correct movements, or in our terms, particularly with GameSense, you'll be manipulating things like space and time to make a desired outcome occur for you. So a brief overview of the 4 looks at what first space, the direction you'll travel, the levels, low, medium, high, the dimensions, the patterns and formations that you'll use. The relationships, how your body part, holding a tennis racket, will affect something. The points of contact, other people, the relationship you have with teammates, apparatus and equipment, and team formations. The dynamics, force and flow, how much force you apply to something. So think of someone who drives a golf ball off a tee, trying to hit it 250 meters, as opposed to someone who's putting for 2 feet. The amount of force they use is going to change dramatically. And flow, is it smooth, is it bound? Okay, is it continuous or can it be stopped? And of course time, musical application. So rhythm in sports is huge. Okay, coordination of your movement, your duration, your momentum, your acceleration, all these things all come to affect our movement. So the first one, here we go, space. What is it? Well, it's the unlimited or incalculably great 3-dimensional realm of expanse in which all material objects are located and all events occur. It's the portion or extent of this in a given instance, an area in 3 dimensions, this space occupied by a body. So we'll look at space in terms of the dimensions of a football field. Okay, but we'll also look at it in terms of width. Imagine you're standing in basketball defense. How far out do you spread your arms for width? Okay, or length. If you jump somewhere, the length or the depth that you get. All right, and then the height that's required in movement. So space affects all these things. Now, space is all around us. A body exists in space, it moves in space, and it's contained by space. It includes the air we breathe and the objects and the people around us. It also concerns the area occupied by the performer and the area in and around the performer, as well as how the composer chooses to use their space. So we have a couple of types of space. Firstly, we have personal space, and that's the area directly around the human body. And then, of course, we have our general space. This is the area outside our personal space which is shared by others and also equipment. Performance space. This is the physical area that contains the event or performance. So on a soccer field, it's the boundaries, the sidelines and the back line. Here we've got the example of swimming, which is the pools, the lanes, the blocks and the wall. All these places characterize or indicate the type of movement that needs to be performed. Okay, so for us, particularly when we hit GameSense, how movement changes space. So manipulating space allows athletes to influence the outcome. And this is a big thing when we get to GameSense. Closing the gap, creating the gap. So how do we use that? And remember I talked about it's actually an interaction of the 4 elements. So closing the gap would be by reducing space, but creating a gap would be by widening the gap or widening space, but also applying time. So maybe acceleration to run into a gap. And of course, being able to accelerate is going to be affected by a force, the amount of force that we apply into our feet to try and move in a strong action to get this quick acceleration. So all those things will come to interact. The following are the components of space that will be addressed: the shape, direction, the level, the dimensions, the patterns and formations, and also the planes of motion. So, shape is a three-dimensional space that is created by the lines of the body or the objects around the body. Can be formed with the whole body or with body parts. Can be made individually, in pairs, or in groups. So if you think curved shapes. So again, if we were talking swimming, we might be talking about the arms that are used in butterfly, or we might be talking about the arm of the discus thrower. Alright, if we're talking straight shapes, we might be talking about a sprinter running directly down the track. So things like this in terms of our shape. There are two aspects to this. The lines of the shape, the pathway of the moving body. There you go. So curved, we're talking about the arms of the discus thrower, straight or angular. Okay, the overall shape can be streamlined, symmetrical, which means balanced, so both half in the body's equal, or unbalanced and asymmetrical. So when we're doing things like throwing a ball, we're in an asymmetrical shape. As it says, shapes can be round, twisted, flat, spread out, etc. Shape, it's a strong visual cue. Alright, the shape you take in a sporting, so maybe you're a defensive person in rugby league, and that position you take gives a strong clue to your opposition as to what's going to happen. Okay, or as the example here, the shape of an athlete's body can influence performance and the people watching. For example, the dodge. So we're actually trying to make people think we're shaping one way, but then we actually change at the last moment to go the other way. And again, we'd be looking at also accent of an acceleration to change that. So there's those two time aspects and the force of dynamics that you're going to apply to it. And the last bit, the relationships, well, that's trying to it's a body part initiating movement, but it's also trying to affect the relationship we have with our opponents and put them off balance. The direction, fairly simple. The direction you want to go. Are you moving forwards? Are you moving backwards? Are you moving diagonally to the left, to the right? Okay, in straight lines, in circles, or in zigzags, depending on what sport you're doing. The direction we move can be analysed by examining individual body parts or the body as a whole. So, swimming example again. In freestyle, your body's moving forward down the lane of the pool, but your legs are actually moving up and down to create that movement. In sport, movement will occur in the direction of an attacking team. So if you think that one team's on the attack, they've started in their own half and they've pushed strongly up towards the other end to try and get over the other team's advantage line. Level. That's the position of the athlete or equipment or part of the athlete actually in space relative to the ground. So we have three levels. They're low. So we're talking about below the knees, lying, crouched, sitting or kneeling. Medium, knees to head, standing or travelling. So mainly if we're running or walking, that's in the medium level. High, above the head elevation. And as I said, that means that if someone were to jump off the ground to try and catch a ball, they are now in the high level. Okay, if they put their hand up above their head to catch a ball, they're in that part of their body is in the high level, and of course the ball itself is in the high level. So as it says here, an athlete may move through one or more of these in one task or performance. Dimensions, these are the space that the body occupies. It includes the relationships of the body to other objects. Includes personal and general space and describes the extent or the movement within the usable space, because of course bodies can expand or shrink. So we look here at dimensions. We look at performers vary their height, their width and their depth of the movement. So again, we're talking about height. Maybe in basketball you're going to lay up and score 2 points against the backboard. You leave the ground and you go up high with the ball. Width, it affects your width. you're going to actually narrow, you're going to shrink, you're going to make your body into a cylindrical shape that's quite narrow. And the depth, and that is the how you protect yourself or how far you go in your jump. Okay, so to make ourselves narrow, it says we can turn side on and sneak through a small opening. Okay, we know that depth is created using forwards and backwards movements by changing direction, and width is created using sideways movement. And of course, height is created by moving up and down through levels. The dimensions of this performance space. So each field or court has certain dimensions that define the available performance space. When a performer steps outside the prescribed dimension, there is often a penalty. So that's where our relationships would come in with our officials. Now, in terms of game sense, a very good strategy is often to change the dimensions of the performance space. So you might exaggerate something to try and make your point. So you're going to change. You might be making the boundaries wider. You might be making them narrower. You might be making a court short or a court long. All these things will affect your game sense movement. The field court dimensions also determine the numbers of players and the rules of the activity. And once again, in game sense, a very good way to manipulate your games is to change the numbers of players. We'll read patterns and formations. It's not as relevant to you, but we'll do it anyway. Created when performers and their body parts move in general space. So we can see that these patterns by watching the performance. They can be made in the air or on the ground. So thinking about rugby league, maybe to play the ball, and you'll have people lined out, and there'll be depth there. They're creating a pattern. They might then try and use a runaround to try and create an overlap. So that particular pattern is being created. Or maybe they run up the side and they're going to kick crossfield towards the corner to try and get a try. Again, it's patterns that are created in sport. Of course, people will change their patterns, as it says here, to avoid running into players, to try and confuse the opposition and put them off balance, and of course to respond to movements of the opposition. So when they dodge one way, you try and match that to try and stop them gaining space. Finally, the planes of motion. There are 3 planes that your body moves in. First one, the transverse. The transverse plane divides your body into top and bottom. Okay, sagittal divides your body into right and left, and the frontal plane divides your body into front and back parts. So let's start with sagittal. Imagine that there was a line drawn on the ground, and you stood with 1 foot either side of that line. If you walk forward in that line, you're in the sagittal plane. You're remaining in the sagittal plane. Okay? As soon as you were to move off that line, you are no longer going in the sagittal plane. The frontal plane divides the bodies into front and back. So now you've got the line going sideways and you're actually standing with both feet on the line. As you move sideways on that line, in either of the 2 directions, to your left or to your right, you're moving in the frontal plane. Okay? But as soon as you move off that line, so if you were to step forward off that line, you're no longer in the frontal plane, you'd be in the sagittal plane. And finally, the transverse plane divides your body into top and half. So just imagine that this time the line's gone right through the middle of you. So when you twist shapes like that, that's in the transverse plane. And that's our references. So don't panic if you don't understand all of that. The idea is just to get some understanding, because it will be important when we come to applying some of this in our game sense understanding later in the semester. There's my references.